right. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the nice setup. You said expert presenter. That feels a little not sure what to do with that. I hope that I give you good expertise. Thanks a bunch for joining today, and going to have a great conversation. We're going to talk through some challenges that I think are facing a lot of organizations as our cloud environments become more dynamic, more interconnected. We're going to talk about gaps in sort of traditional detective tools and how cloud detection and response, or CDR, as we've said, can help fill those gaps. And by the end of the session, I hope you'll have a better understanding of how to enhance your SOC operations with actionable cloud context to be able to detect, investigate, and respond to threats faster and more effectively. So let's kind of, I guess, get to it, if that's all right. And I guess I should say I sometimes speak a little bit fast, so I apologize to anybody if that's difficult. So just a quick note about myself. I am the former CISO of Oklahoma Gas and Electric, which is a electric utility in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I spent about 14 years there, and the last 7 or so I was the chief security officer. So I have about 20 years in cybersecurity. I would say that I'm very passionate about tackling security challenges. That's something that, I was always the guy who was willing to run into the fire instead of run away from it. Maybe that's bad, I don't know. And I am a former customer of Stream. And so when just sort of the way that things worked and I was able to join the team, this is something that I'm really happy about. I think what Stream does is great. And I'm glad to be part of it and hope to be able to share that with you and hope you'll see what I saw. So what we're going to start off with today is I want us to understand what's referred to as the Rumsfeld matrix, which is named after a former, he was Secretary of Defense. I believe he was a congressman for a while. He had a couple different roles within the George H.W. Bush administration, but he talked about known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, and unknown knowns. And I'm sorry, that's a lot of the use of the word known there, but I think it's important. And so we're going to talk about this Rumsfeld matrix a good bit today. And what we're really shooting for is trying to understand how we can be where those known knowns are as much as possible, and to remove as many of the unknown unknowns as possible. And so I would just say, as a CISO, I always hated the sort of "are we secure" type questions, because it's very difficult to answer that, as I'm sure many of you are aware, right? So when we think about cloud and what makes that difficult to answer those "are we secure" type questions, we think about the idea that our traditional on-prem solutions don't really lend themselves to the cloud very well, that our cloud environments are very dynamic, very, very dynamic, and they're built that way, and that they're a bit different than our on-prem client server-based models, and that as we continue to evolve in cloud, right, we get even more complex, we get even more interconnected. We are connecting business systems that weren't historically in the cloud. We are connecting business systems. If we go way back and think about what our public-facing websites or web presences might have been and what they are today, they're vastly different and they're way more connected. And if we're really honest too, we now have lots of critical business functions that are performed in the cloud. I can remember years ago as a graduate student thinking about what can you do on the internet? And now if I were to think, 20 some odd, close to 30 years later, I think about how, like, the opposite of that question is really, what can't you do on the internet? And it's an interesting way of thinking. And so when we think about those sort of problems, or think of them as a sort of problem statement, the way they position us on this matrix is a bit of a tough spot for us, right? Our level of awareness, our understanding are really diminished in the cloud compared to our traditional on-prem visibility that we've spent a long time working on. And that puts us in a bad place from a security perspective, because that means that there are more unknown unknowns. We don't even know what's going to hit us out of left field. And that is, as a security person, I would posit that that's kind of a bad spot to be, right? You always want to know your fact pattern and know what you're dealing with, because then you can protect it or defend against or whatever. And so that becomes a challenge. So when we look at some of these challenges that our SOC teams face because of the Rumsfeld matrix, it kind of breaks into a few categories, right? So let's connect that matrix, which I would say is a more strategic view, to the sort of tactical implications for our SOC teams. So not fully knowing or understanding our environments can lead us to data quality issues, right? If we follow the sort of traditional approach of turning on everything, right? When we all got SIMs way back in the day, we were like, well, what data do you want? And the answer is, we wanted all of it, right? So if we turn on everything, now we're going to foul up our sort of signal to noise ratio. And we're going to end up probably with tons of false positives as a result, right? We'll have more noise than signal. And that the important things might be drowned out, and we'll get a sort of raft of false positives. And so thanks to our high data volume, we run the risk of overwhelming our SOC teams then, because they're going to have to spend an enormous amount of time manually investigating alerts, which, like I said, many of which turn out to be noise. And that leads to delays in identifying sort of real threats or real issues, because we've spent so much time on these noisy false positives that now we don't have enough time to spend on enough time is probably a bad way to say that. We're able to spend less time on the more meaningful things, because we're sort of filtering through trying to find those, right? And so that can be difficult, and that again sort of crunches our team, and we've got a lot of tough there. And then that gives us some questions, right? So if we've increased the volume of our data, what does that do to our SIM events per second or our SIM licensing? Are we, as a result of trying to get all this data, now incurring more costs with our cloud because of the sort of increases in the bits and bytes of security data that now we're either piping? I'm sorry, I talk with my hands a lot too, just as a FYI, I apologize. That's a shiny object, I guess. We end up having to pipe all this data from our cloud environment into our on-prem, or we have to store it somewhere within our cloud environment. So we're ending up paying more. And so as a result of sort of security, have we increased the cost of doing business in the cloud that wasn't even calculated in our original kind of ROI calc for justifying whether we even do this in the cloud? And so it creates some trouble for us. And the idea that we're spending more money on cloud just because of security probably doesn't float well in a lot of organizations. And I think as a really thoughtful, business-focused security leader, we ought to be careful with that. And so, that kind of gets crazy. And so if we're thinking about how we're going to sort out all these false positives, then we go to the next step kind of in our legacy playbook. We move from these, everything's highly manual to now we have, for at least for analysis, now we have manual detection rules that we're going to craft, right? So we're gonna craft a bunch of rules and alerts. We've adjusted parsers. We've created parsers. We've got if this then else sort of logic, right? Well, in the cloud, our environments are very different, right? Our configurations, our assets, our identities, they're constantly changing on purpose in a lot of reasons, right? We spool up or we spool down with compute resources. We have serverless computing. We've got lots of things there in the cloud, and the dynamism of that type of environment in my mind, makes the idea of manual detection rules a Sisyphusian difficult task, right? Where Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, and you get to the top, and then it goes all the way back to the bottom, and there you are again. Like, it's difficult. And then if we think about additional complications of that, what if Frank or Mary or whomever, the ones that are responsible or accountable for having to keep those rules up, well, what if they get sick and the environment changes and they're not there that day? Or what if they leave the company? Even worse. Well, now we've got all these rules that no one knows what's happening, right? We've got much difficulty, right? We have something occurring, but we don't know exactly why or how, and we have rules that may not even be there, that they may not even be valuable. We may not even be looking at the right things, right? And then another one that is something that, as a sort of asset owner or a customer, we can't necessarily account for, which is, what if our cloud vendor makes big changes to their functionality or to their nomenclature, right? If we think about a few years ago where Microsoft, on like a Thursday, it was all Azure AD, right? And then on the next Tuesday, it was Intra AD. And I remember this. I don't think that Microsoft even had time in that change to go update their documentation. And so if the term changes, then if my manual rule or my parsing is looking for a certain regular expression or feature or phrase, and that feature or phrase is now changed, is my rule working? Can I really detect, right? And so that creates complexity and trouble. And if we think about the strain on our SOC, we start to we have difficulty in understanding how identity really plays a role in cloud in ways that maybe it didn't in the past in our on-prem, right? In our on-prem thought process, if you were able to connect to the logical or physical network via VPN, or because you were connected to a switch in an office because you were there at the office, you're allowed to get in because your device is authenticated, or at least it's enabled to connect on the network. Well, that's not always the case in cloud. Your identity is there, right? And then we have other configurations or even misconfigurations that can add complexity. And then what our assets in cloud look like are different. And now we have to think about how identity and configuration and assets interact in real time. And that makes it really hard to respond to what's happening. It's as if we're just sort of drinking from the biggest fire hose ever. And that's a real challenge, right? And so if we think about this for our SOC analysts, well, how many interfaces can we expect any SOC analyst to be able to really understand, right? How many different interfaces can they get to? Do they have fluency in each of those? Do they look at them every day? What again if the nomenclature changes, or Microsoft or Google or Amazon moves where the button is, or changes or adds a tab? Who knows? There could be all kinds of difficulty there. And then that could lead us to the point where we could get so sidetracked just trying to get data or figure out the tool to give us the access to the data that we slow our ability to respond, which is not ideal for our businesses, right? Those are big challenges, right? So we end up with a lot of data, and our data has poor quality, which makes our manual analysis difficult, and means we have a lot of false positives, and we have difficulty in handling the volume of that data. Making detection rules is tough. Who's going to maintain them? How do we keep them up? And then how does the dynamism of our cloud environment really affect what we're able to do? And how many places do we have to go look to find our data, right? If we were to sum up some of our big challenges there to our SOC teams, I think those are a pretty good microcosm of what's going on. So let's look at that for a second too, and think about our traditional approach versus kind of what we're really looking for. Or maybe I'll say this, our traditional approach bolting on what we've done in the past with legacy tools into what we're really looking for. So if we think about our agent coverage, and there's some animations, which I just realized I don't know if they're going to be here or not, and that's okay. There is an animation that you're missing. But if we have agent coverage, our agent is installed on a device, and it can see itself, but it may not be able to see, and you can't see my cursor moving on the right side, it may not be able to see all the interconnectivity. And so on the right side, if we assumed that those dots were identity or configuration or an asset type, server, serverless, container, bucket, something, what we're really trying to do is have that interconnected visibility, right? And so think about, how do our legacy tools really fit within the cloud? Right. And again, our goal is to know what's happening. And so if I get an agent and I'm going to install it in my old client server based methodology, well, the agent's going to have a lot of visibility onto what's happening on that server or client or database server, whatever it is. And so it's going to increase my known knowns and hopefully decrease my known unknowns. But if I have an environment that doesn't lend itself to an agent, well, then that's going to be tough. And think about too, like, do y'all remember when we were dropping agents all over our legacy environments, right? We were like, well, we can just put an agent on that. Well, now, how do we deploy agents across our cloud environment that don't really fit that, right? How do we do a traditional agent in a serverless environment? Or if we're thinking AWS, a Lambda function, right? There's not a clean way to make an agent for a simple, Python-based Lambda function that does one thing, it's tough. And so an agent itself, or what we think of as a traditional agent that might have been compiled code, validating whether something is touching the master file table, or using role-based access control that should or shouldn't have given it should or shouldn't have had, those can be tough. And so even when we can deploy those types of agents, we're only seeing part of the story. And that's what I would say that on the left side of this slide is really illustrating for us, is that with that agent, we can see one part of it. We can see that agent can see itself, but its field of vision is limited. And so if we were to think of the red line around that agent as sort of the limit of its field of vision, well, just in this simple case, right, there's 5 other instances, we'll say, that it has no visibility into, and that's tough. And so we'll ask ourselves, right, is an obscured field of vision acceptable? Right? And so I would probably argue no, not in the long term, not for our business critical systems, not for the things that are cloud facing, that are the key we make money or we operate as a business, right? Our goal, according to the Rumsfeld matrix, though, is to sort of gain complete visibility into behavior, understand how it's going to impact our environment and our company, right? And so if our deployed agent has constraints, it can be helpful, but it's not going to give us the full context that we really need or are looking for to be able to get to that sweet spot on the Rumsfeld matrix. And so that's kind of a challenge for us. And so if we have agents, and there are other sort of downsides of this too, right? If we have agents that they're positioned in our organization logically in a spot where it's so far into, let's think of the cyber kill chain. It's so deep into that kill chain that now a malicious actor could have persistence, and I don't see it until they're really deep. Well, then it's going to limit my number of moves as a responder to be able to prevent a malicious actor from being able to do something that could harm me. And we're so late in that sort of chain, in that situation, that the impact is going to be much greater. And so that's a real problem, if you ask me, for our traditional on-prem agent-based mindset that just doesn't really fit in the cloud. So we got to think of another way. We got to find a different way, which is just fine. And when we think about that, we started with, if we go back to sort of the dynamic of on-prem and then cloud, right? We got on-prem, we had agents, we had SIMs, we were piping all our data to places. We get to the cloud, we try to use the same playbook. It doesn't really lend itself. And so just about the time when we start realizing that our legacy tools of agents and SIM and EDR and buzzword bingo, just say whatever you want, weren't sufficient to protect us, we got a new player in the space, right? So now we have CSPM. Right. And so we've got these sort of understanding now that our legacy tools are sort of a square peg going into a round hole. And now we get CSPM, and it's supposed to be this silver bullet for us. It's going to fix a lot of our problems. And let me be clear, I certainly believe that there is value in CSPM, but I don't believe that it puts us in the sweet spot for the Rumsfeld matrix. And so let's talk about that a little bit, and kind of see, maybe we see if we agree or disagree on that. So when we look at that, we can see that CSPM, I would say we should think about it that CSPM was really built for hardening, and that by its very name, we ought to think, wait, something could be missing here, because posture management tells me how my environment is or might be set up, but it doesn't really tell me what's going on right now. And the way that our lots of CSPM solutions out there work, right, is that we perform a periodic scan, which again goes back to some same things that we had with things like automated vulnerability scanners for our on-prem environments, that sort of stuff. That they're a bit of a snapshot. It's a point in time, right? So we can have things occur, but if they occur outside of a scan window, before or after, or during, but not visible, then how valuable really is that to us for an incident, from an incident response perspective? And then another thing too that I think a lot of our CSPM behaviors are not, is that they're not event driven. We don't fire off a CSPM scan because we saw some behavior, we generally fired off on a schedule. So we'll know what our posture was when the scan was run. And that again, that's kind of a legacy thought process, which again, not bad. It's just, I don't think it's complete. And so don't hear me saying that CSPM is not helpful. I just don't know if it's complete. And again, our goal here is to try to get into that sweet spot with the Rumsfeld matrix of minimizing our unknown unknowns, or any form of unknown really, and increasing our knowledge of our environment, the known knowns. And so let's look at a couple of, like, maybe we dig into a couple other sort of philosophical things on on the cloud layer versus CSPM, I guess. So configuration changes by attackers, or I mean, honestly, attackers, maybe I should have said that differently on the slide, that many of the changes that we see are probably not even intended to be malicious. It could be a developer or someone else within the IT department trying to make a change to enable something to work so that they can do their job. But those changes are maybe or may or may not be visible because of the dynamism of cloud. If I, as an example, right, I could go in and I'm having trouble connecting to something, and so I change a virtual firewall rule to allow an any, for example. But I turn it on, I set that rule to any after a scan is completed, and I go and do whatever it is I need to do, and then I reset the rule. But a scan hasn't run in between those two times. Well, so then if I'm just doing a sort of static analysis, well, then it's not going to pick up that change. It won't know that for a period of minutes or hours or whatever the duration was, or time between maybe the cadence between my scans, if I've changed it but between one scan and the next, then the scanner wouldn't have any understanding of what was happening there. It wouldn't know that change took place, or potentially even what the impacts might be. And then we think about ephemeral assets in the cloud, right? That those generally don't get scanned because there's what do you scan on a Python script, or what do you scan on? It's just different, right? We're thinking maybe in a legacy Windows world, and we're not dealing with a legacy Windows world, even a Unix or Linux world where we could still have enough consistency there to do some scanning and expected behavior. So, that is a challenge. And so what I would tell you is that now let's look a little bit at CDR, and let's understand some differences there in what this CSPM is. And I apologize, I feel like I am now playing buzzword bingo because I'm using these sort of Gartner-esque terms. And so let's look at what we have and go from there. And so I'm sorry for saying acronyms over and over again. So if we think about real-time cloud context, that's what we're probably after. And so I apologize, I'm going to be showing you a few slides here in a minute that are like in the coming minutes that I think are going to end up being eye charts for you. There's a feature here in this Goldcast. I'm sorry, I don't even know what the portal platform is here, but there's a feature that enables you to full screen this sucker, and you can make it bigger. But if you think about how we would want to take our logs from our cloud environments, and then think about what we know that, kind of referred to this as an exploitability feed. We can get lists of CVEs or DSPM, another thing, where's our critical data? Or if we have threat intel sources, we can get lots of stuff there. We're matching all of that data together to give us the context that we need. And so, and then we start to get outputs. If we think of CDR as that sweet spot in the Rumsfeld matrix, and this is where we start to assemble our known knowns, then now we've got all this data together. And so let me show you perhaps in a different way. And so when we say context, let's make sure, I guess, we're kind of talking about the known here. So context for CDR isn't point in time, right? When we think of incident response, we really want real time, or at least near real time data, because that helps us establish our fact pattern. Not having real time data is like, if we were trying to figure out what's going on in the world today by reading a newspaper from 100 years ago instead of looking for the news feed on our phone, right? We can see what happened, but we don't really, is that the right info? Is that the really what's happening, ground truth? And so got to be careful there. And so we want to make sure we're using real time. And there's a bunch of examples in history where people didn't have that right context and then they made terrible decisions. I think of some things in World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, lots of stuff there, but I don't want to digress. So in response, what we want to do to be dealing with the sort of known knowns to establish our fact pattern is to get some context. And I'm really not just talking about security incident response either. I'm talking about operational response, right? When something breaks, we want to make sure that we understand what's really happening and what the impacts are so that we can make the right move to get the business function re-enabled so that it's operational and able to do what it can do, right? And that if we're really honest, I think we could argue that having a better understanding of our environment enables all of our IT, security, cloud, infrastructure, whomever teams to enable our businesses to be better at what they do, right? So I think going forward, the best versions of those teams are gonna do just that. They're gonna provide that full context to their peers and other members of their organization to help the organization be able to meet their goals by understanding what's really happening. And then the teams that can't get on that bus, that aren't able to get this sort of full context, are going to struggle, and it's going to create challenges to organizations, right? And so they're going to get buried under logs or lists of vulnerabilities or burn themselves out on things that don't move the business forward. So let's look real quick at context just to kind of give you some insight into kind of what I mean by when I say that, right? And so we've got some sort of Venn diagram action going here, right? So the first thing I think we can think about is identity. As I said, right, like it's really important to think of identity as a critical element of cloud. With identity, we understand what access is permitted, what is being actively used, and if you know who's able to do and see what, and who's able to move data in and around your environment, that helps you to know what's happening there, right? When we look at, and next circle here in this diagram is our network environment, right? Understanding what access is there, and then what maybe if we think of it in terms of assets or resources or servers or data is accessible or reachable from the internet or from what one point to another point within our cloud environments is really important, right? It helps us to know what's happening. Now I'm gonna skip Kubernetes for a moment. And honestly, we got Kubernetes there. That could be containers. I probably went slightly too in depth there. Probably containers. Again, knowing what's going on in those containers. I said I was going to skip this, and I'm going to just talk about it anyway. What's happening, where our containers are, what data they have in them, who can access them, are our crown jewels in those? If someone were to wipe that data or modify it in a way that made it not have integrity, could it be relied upon in a way that would continue to let our business operate? And so that's really important to know that. And the threat intelligence, right? Do we have data from external sources that helps us to spot a potential tactic, technique, or procedure from a malicious actor, or indicators of compromise that might tell us about exploitability, kind of, again, where we're trying to get some known knowns and some known unknowns? If we think back to, I mentioned earlier, the idea of the cyber kill chain, there's another sort of adjacent thought to that, which is the pyramid of pain, which talks about how there are only certain ways to interact with information systems, and that most malicious actors are going to stick with the easiest one to do. If we make it harder on them, then by knowing those TTPs and IOCs, that we make it harder on them, and maybe they'll just move on. And so knowing those, so having identity, network, containers, threat intel, those are all very, very important. And then if we think about exploitability, right, like where are the vulnerable assets in our environment? We all have them. We do, right? Again, is it data? Is it something that's a process? Is it who knows what? The critical, I think of, do I have the nuclear launch codes, whatever it is? Those are really important. And so knowing where those assets are and who can access them and what controls are there is important. And again, every asset if we're really honest, right, every asset within our environment is not configured the same. We don't have the same security controls off of everything. We probably shouldn't. We could go to the idea that we would treat gold like gold and pencils like pencils, and so we wouldn't want to spend gold money on pencils. Why? It doesn't help us. We should go focus the gold money on the things that are gold, if that makes sense. And so when we think context now, we're going to use all this data to help us prioritize what's going on in our environment, what events are meaningful to us, what could be a threat, what could be difficult. And then even beyond that, we could think about, how would an adversary operate, going back to the cyber kill chain? How is an adversary going to go traverse through our environment and be able to do things that can hurt us? And so let me show you some examples of this context in action through our Stream platform. So let me jump in here and do that. So again, this one is definitely an eye chart. And so zoom this sucker in, or go as we're seeing, go and grab this from the cart. We've given you the slides here so that you have them. This is our platform, and this is just the main dashboard that for CISOs like I was, this is probably way more information than they need, but it's helping to understand the idea that if I were to whip back over to this slide here, let me see if I can get back to it, and we want to mash all this stuff together and sort of run it through a funnel, well, our dashboard here is sort of helping us to do that. And so let me kind of talk through, if you're zoomed in, maybe I can help you to kind of see what we've got, right? So if we think about our Rumsfeld matrix, let's look here at the top of the screen. We can see that all of our cloud environments are included, right? That we've got Microsoft and Google and our containers, and Azure is there, and we're I'm sorry, I said Azure already. I said Microsoft already. AWS, we've got all those. So all of our cloud environments are there, and we should not think, well, we only do a little bit in that cloud environment, so maybe we don't need to look at it. That's the kind of stuff where you're going to end up getting bitten in the behind and you didn't even realize it. And that becomes, there's a lot of unknowns occurring in that environment if you're not seeing it. And so we've got all the environments. And then if we look a little further, we can see some descriptions of a real-time attack surface. We can see a list of our active risks that we've identified based on our context. We can see an activity log. Again, if we're relying on point-in-time scans, there's a whole world of things that we may never know about because we won't have seen them because they occurred between when one scan and another ran, or they could have been reverted before the next scan operated, right? And so we would never have seen them. And so we're showing some vulnerabilities here as well, but only so far as how they would add context for exploitability, right? So let's look further. We'll go into a specific incident here again. And my apologies, I'm not exactly sure how this is showing up on your screen. And so use the feature that you have to full screen this thing, and you can see it on your, if you have a giant monitor, then you should be able to see that. So let's go look again at a full, we'll go into an investigation. So one of the things that we at Stream really like, and going back again to the idea of this cyber kill chain, is that we're drilling into an event, and this event may turn into an incident, but it may not. And so it enables us to understand sort of some known knowns in the environment. So here we can see that we're focused in on an EC2 bucket in this case. It's internet exposed. And then some modeling and some things that we have at Stream are enabling us to understand some more and better context. Again, I'm going to go back to this slide. Like, again, we're getting some data here, and so we're getting some context to help us to make some decisions. And so here we can see in a couple of different places, you guys can't see my screen. So if you look at the top, you can see some misconfigurations. If you look at the some tippers for you. And if you look at the black box, then they're there as well. So we've got some type of misconfiguration based on a standard that our organization has previously identified. That our Stream platform is saying, hey, this could be problematic. We've got some form of escalated privilege that's being utilized. We have data access, and we can also access data or some other resource that we've identified, our organization has identified as a crown jewel, and the Stream platform is telling us, hey, that's a crown jewel. And this screen gives us a visualization of the attack path and where the activity is occurring in the attack path, and data about things that are identified as sort of findings, if you will, And it wouldn't take like a super cyber ninja unicorn to figure out that this is something that we want to make sure we're looking at closer, because now we can see an attack path. We can see the relative position to our crown jewels, that if you look to the right, you can see that. You can see where our platform is calling that out. So now we have some understanding. And then again, you don't need to be the super cyber ninja unicorn. You just see the diagram. And because we've got all this data in one place, we're sort of lowering the skill level necessary to make sense of what's going on. We are getting to a sweeter spot in the Rumsfeld matrix because our known knowns are increasing, because now we have a sense of, here's all the steps, here's all of the information about what's going on in this situation. We can drill even further. But the idea that even having this data, I can remember going and doing investigations where we're grabbing someone from the network team and someone from the infrastructure team and someone from the identity team and multiple someones from the security operations team. And we're getting different logs together, and someone's having to cobble CSVs that we say, all right, well, so here's the log data and here's what's happening. And it becomes difficult because we're trying to figure out what exactly is happening. And this is data that, if we're really honest, that stuff for years has had this capability on an endpoint, right? You could have had lots of different tools that would have shown you everything on an endpoint that an application touched, and that everything that the endpoint communicated with, and every application that ran on that. There's lots of stuff there. And so if you could see that on our traditional legacy tools, but you can't generally see these things in the cloud, and so you're missing context. And so that's why it's really important. Let me show you a slightly different view as well to kind of give you where we're going. And once again, please drill into this. So now we are fully seeing what we have with our visualization, and we've got a timeline of activity on top of it. So a question for y'all, for our participants here, like, is it meaningful for us to know that we're seeing get commands in a Dynamo database? Do we think that's meaningful? And our platform here even spells out as a tipper that this appears to be some sort of data exfiltration. And so, as I said, this is the kind of stuff that we've had for years in EDR tools on-prem for a Windows device that's an end user computing device, that we're seeing commands and things that are executing. But we don't generally have the ability to see this in our cloud environments for a lot of reasons. It's been hard to get that. Again, agents don't lend themselves. How do you put an agent on a infrastructure as a service platform? Those are tough. And so again, having this level of visibility where we're now showing you the attack path, we're giving you a visualization, we're giving you a timeline that's associated with it. Our number of known knowns is increasing, and our number of unknown knowns and unknown unknowns is decreasing, right? And so we're getting some idea of what's happening. And one of the things that I really like about this, and this is one of the things that drew me to Stream as a customer, was the idea that I could get this really quickly, and that I could have a timeline, and it would enable my folks to get into action quickly, right? We can have higher confidence that actions we might take are going to actually help remediate a problem, right? Let's think about that, like some further context, right? If we historically had a VM or a container that we would say maybe it was just acting up, it was performing or behaving in a way that was abnormal. Well, what's our first move? And shoot, forget the idea that it's a container. Think about it as a Windows box. What's our first move, right? Have you tried turning it off and on again? Right? Or if it's a VM or if it's a container, then one of the first things that we do is we're dropping the VM or container, and we're going to restore it from last known good configuration, right? But if our malicious actor or somebody else has created persistence that is somewhere adjacent to but not directly tied to that container or VM, we just rebooted or restored or whatever, and we might have gotten dressed up for nothing and taken action that gave us no value. So got to be careful there. And so having that context, instead of spending our time blowing away something that isn't going to help us, which could also, in an incident response scenario, blow away evidence that could be valuable to us. And it turns out it does nothing for us, but we wiped away some evidence, but we didn't stop the attacker. Well, then, like, why would we want to spend our time on that? So having a timeline is really great, and it's really, really helpful and valuable to us. And so then one more thing that now I'll drill in one more layer deep. And so now here is something else that I think is something great that we're seeing. The emergence of AI went from sort of FUD and talk and marketing fluff to now lots of generally available use cases that I think AI is pretty good. So here is a scenario where we're giving you the ability to generate an overview of the investigation that can be used to explain our fact pattern to other people. Right, and so we can use this to explain to members of our team or other teams or even another organization of what's going on and why we're asking them to get into action, right? So think about, again, in your traditional like multi-team, a multifaceted incident response scenario, if the security operations guy is asking the network guy to make changes or the infrastructure guy to make changes, well, they're gonna need to understand why, or they're gonna not make the change because they're not gonna create an operational impact that then would be blamed on them. And so here we have an ability to give you full context. This is why the actions we're suggesting are necessary. Here are some indicators of a compromise. Here are some tactics and techniques and procedures that we're observing that this is why we think what we've got. This can tell us whether we still have a malicious actor that's active within our environment. This can tell us what changes have been made. This can tell us the assets, the data, the functions that we got to go look closer at to make sure that we've got confidentiality, integrity, availability, those sorts of things. And when we have this sort of data, we're increasing the known knowns, not gnomes, all over the place, right? This is getting really helpful and valuable. And in incident response scenarios, one of the things that always is difficult is having to be able to write up what happened. And so if we come back to the previous slide and we look at this timeline that we're starting to develop here at the bottom, well, I'm giving you now a timeline of events. And then if I give you our write-up of here's what we have, so I can take my timeline and I can take my events and I can use those to be able to explain. If I have to tell my board of directors or my corporate security team or my general counsel or whomever, my insurance company, whomever, in the event of a breach, I've now got a very cogent list that may be technical jargon, but maybe not. And it's going to have a timeline. It's going to have details. This is the kind of thing that makes my incident response capabilities much, much better. And so if I were to sort of kind of wrap on that, I would say that through CDR, we're getting increased context of things that really help us and matter, right? These sort of the Venn diagram here of the sort of important elements of data that are necessary for us to understand the known, that just, let's just say this, that we would know our environment better. You guys have got me all subconscious about gnomes. And I'm sorry, I talk fast. I said that at the beginning. But the idea that we have an understanding of our environment so that we are the ones that know what's happening and that we have the ideas of what is normal versus abnormal from our baseline or what's really happening. And then we've reduced those Rumsfeldian unknowns, right? We don't need a list of stuff to fix or patch without context. We will have a sort of near real-time view of what's actually going on, what we need to do about it, what the implications are, all that sort of stuff. And I mentioned that I was a customer of Stream before I joined, and this is a capability that really got me excited because we could start to do something with it and take our cloud environments and create a feature parity between our cloud environment and our on-prem environment and really do well. And so if we increase our known knowns, we're making security less hard. We don't have to have the same level of skill for all of our SOC team members. We speed our mean time to response. We reduce the impact of malicious actors within our environment. We create artifacts that would have otherwise been very challenging for us to put together. Lots of positives that can come out of this, right? And we can then take all of that data and give a really excellent fact-based, known answer to the question about whether or not we're secure. That's why I really feel strongly about this, and I think it's really important. And I think this is a value proposition that is a little bit different, and that is really necessary for those really high-functioning, high-mature organizations to be able to execute. And yes, thank you. That now we've clearly defined the nomenclature of what we have.
That's my favorite. That's my favorite from the whole day. The nomenclature.
I don't know if I get a vote, but I think that might be gift card worthy.
Yeah, that was pretty great. I have to say the idea all started, Jason, with Dean suggesting that there be a known gnome figurine that you could sell. So you could have the full kit. You could have the known gnome and the unknown gnome, and they could battle it out on your desk.
Nice. Yeah, that's great.
This is important. Somebody with a 3D printer needs to make this happen, because
yeah.
Jason, so much information, and I feel like there's a lot of pieces here that we could unpack. We are very close to the end of time, so we're going to have to wrap things up, but I want to try to get to just a few questions. What you were kind of hitting on right at the end there actually is kind of hitting a few of the questions that we got around bringing this to leadership, say, like, how do you make the argument for the ROI? And I think you've kind of hit that at the end. Is there any sort of summative point that you want to put to that, sort of the key ROIs that someone could bring to their leadership team?
Well, sure. Yeah. And there are a couple questions that I can see here too when we talk about conflicts with existing security tools.
Yes,
that's a great thought. The idea, like I always, as a CISO, hated it when I had somebody roll into my office and tell me, well, everything you have is terrible. It's bad. It's not good enough. You have to get rid of everything that you've invested potentially millions of dollars on over a decade with a lot of man hours and lots of other things, and get rid of them. That's not what I am saying here. What I would tell you is the best way to do this is let's find the tools that work for you and see how we can use those to add fidelity to the information that we've gathered through our context to be able to understand our environment even better, right? If you have, and I didn't say this, but like, big deal, Wiz just got announced for $30 billion with a B as an acquisition from Google. That's fantastic to show the value of this space. I wouldn't tell you to get rid of Wiz. I would say, hey, Wiz can help us to understand exploitability in our environment a little bit. So if we look at the kill chain and where we have things, and so like, hey, this becomes, because we know that there are 10 active exploits available from malicious actors in the space, that's going to increase the risk of that, whatever cloud asset is, and it's going to be there. And so I think what I would tell you is that you're trying to layer in your security tools in a way that help you to make sense of what's going on in a way that can help you. And then there are certain things with the Stream platform, for example, if we've got some visibility capabilities that you're paying natively for through some of the tools that I don't think they give you the full level of view. This was my experience with AWS, is that we had a guard duty, and it's great. It's not bad, but it doesn't have the full context, and you would have to go to a separate screen to be able to see that then compared to what we're giving you with Stream. You might be able to reduce your cloud cost by reducing some of your spend with AWS and add a utility. Our economics were very focused on reducing O&M spend and increasing CapEx spend. O&M, every dollar of a customer, every dollar of O&M went directly to a customer bill. So we wanted to cut that. And a lot of these cloud tools can be non-predictive spending that is O&M. If you can get a license model that allows you to predict that spend, well, then you can sort of smooth those curves and manage your budget a little bit better. And so I would say this isn't about pick the blue one versus the red one from a tools perspective. Find the right tools that help you, but you should be seeking this type of context to understand your environment, because the truth of it is that you've already been on this journey with your on-prem environments, and you've sorted these problems out in a lot of ways for your on-prem. You need parity between what's happening in your cloud environment and what's happening with your on-prem, so that you really know what you know, and you know your environment is operating as it's designed.
Jason, I want to call out that we've got a couple of comments in the chat saying not just thank you and great information, but thank you for having fun during a technical presentation. I think that might be one of my favorite comments I've seen, because this is so important, and it is important to get on the technical side, but there's no reason that we can't have fun with what we do. And that starts with sort of loving what we do and being passionate about it. And that is something I've certainly seen from you today. I wish we would have had a little bit more time to explore some of these questions. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you one final question, and then I'm going to ask you or let you know and remind everyone in the audience that all of the questions that you have asked are going to get sent to Stream.Security. So you are going to get answers back. You will get responses back. So stay tuned. And if you still have questions, get them in now. Jason, as a final sort of wrap up, if you wanted everyone in the audience to take one action step when they leave this webinar, what would you want that to be?
Well, I would tell you to never stop in the pursuit of understanding the known knowns, and what you don't know and what you do know matters, and make sure that you know what's happening in your environments. Again, I hate the "are we secure" question. And if you understand what's happening, then you're in a better position to be able to understand that.
Well, I agree, and we're all battling the unknown known gnomes, right? Every day. So that's a t-shirt. I think we've got your team here, and Mayan's already planning to have some figurines built by your product team. So get it going. Jason, this has been so much fun, and I really want to thank you for coming and being part of the conversation. As you can see, the chat is still flying, the questions are still coming in. You have absolutely struck a chord with our audience, and it's been such a pleasure chatting with you today.
Well, thanks to everybody for joining, and thanks for participating. Thanks for making this interactive rather than me just feeling as if I'm just sitting here talking to a screen. So I really appreciate it.